Okay, good. We've got some good representation. Who works in the housing sector? Like your job is involved in working in the housing sector. I see one hand in the back. I think you're going to have company. I think there are more people who RSVP'd and should be on their way. Do we have any housing advocates? Anybody who works in advocacy? Okay, I see a couple of hands. So I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the people who are here. And now we're going to get started with our journalism panel. I'd like to introduce Michael Winter, who is our senior editor. And then we have Andrew Stelzer, Liza Veale, and Liz Enochs, who all wrote stories for this issue. Noah Arroyo, our assistant editor, also wrote the cover story for the issue. Noah is going to be moderating the second panel, so we'll let him talk about his work during that panel. All of our reporters on stage are freelancers, freelance journalists. Andrew and Liza also work over at KALW. Andrew is an editor there and works with journalists in San Quentin and Solano prisons. Liza Veale is the housing reporter for KALW. Liz is one of our board members, and she's also a journalist and has worked at a lot of different places and has quite a bit of experience with business journalism. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that if we have time. But I'd like to dive in first and throw this to Michael Winter. How did this project come together? Why did we decide to focus on solutions, and how did we decide to focus on the particular solutions that are in the new issue?
This was an outgrowth of the mayoral campaign. We were noticing at some events that housing, homelessness being, at the top of the list of voters' concerns, various candidates were offering various ideas, and so we gathered many of them, and then we looked at which ones might be either viable or ones that were maybe getting some discussion or were interesting on the face of them. So this is actually kind of a follow-up to the mayoral campaign and a transition as we move into the November campaign and Proposition 10, which is calling for the repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which limits what communities in California can do in terms of regulating rental housing. So that's basically where I was, and we made our selections. Andrew was looking at Proposition F. That was the first story that we had of the campaign, which was the right to counsel. And he also then did a companion piece on mediation as an alternative, both to try to keep tenants stably housed as one solution, as it were, to the housing crisis that we're now facing. When we're talking about solutions, we're looking at, again, some of these, they're not going to be these big, grand, sweeping things. More and more you're finding kind of a smorgasbord approach to deal with different communities and on different levels. So that's where we started. And then we look at other communities around the country, even the world, where some of these ideas have already been tried out and are in process. And Liza Veale wrote about speculators, and this Enochs over there wrote about the ghost tax and vacancy, ghost homes and vacancy tax.
Right, so I'm going to have you pass your microphone down. We're going to start with Liz, talking about ghost homes and vacancy tax. I mean, ghost homes. What are ghost homes? And tell us a little bit about your story.
So this is a term that some people use to refer to homes intentionally left vacant. So a landlord might decide, oh, I'm sick of all my tenants, they've been a pain in my tuchus, and I don't want to deal with that anymore, but I don't want to go through the process of, let's say, taking my home off the market. I'm just going to leave them vacant. Formally taking my home off the market, I'm going to leave them vacant. And so that's kind of what it refers to, is homes that could be used for renters or others who are looking for housing, but that are deliberately being kept off the market.
And why is this a problem for communities, especially in the Bay Area?
Well, in high-cost communities like San Francisco, like Vancouver, like Washington, D.C., these housing is scarce, and we all are concerned about finding housing that we can afford, and prices just continue to go up. And when you keep those homes off the market, you shrink the supply.
Okay, so these vacancy taxes are being proposed for which cities in the Bay Area?
San Francisco is considering putting a tax on the ballot, and it would be the first in the U.S. to have a tax on vacant units. Vancouver passed this law last year, or started implementing this law last year, and they are projecting now that they'll take in about $23 million this year from a tax on what they're calling the empty homes tax. What they've done is they've imposed a 1% tax on homes that are deliberately being kept off the market for one reason or another, and they have a specific way that they determine that. In the Bay Area, Oakland is considering something like this, and San Francisco, Aaron Peskin's office has talked about putting it on the ballot for next year.
Okay, so you've told us about other places where this has been tried. In San Francisco, how many ghost homes are we talking about? How many vacant units have been identified?
So one of the reasons this came up is that what does SPUR stand for? San Francisco Planning and Urban Research, which is a nonprofit urban policy group in San Francisco, did a study a few years back that looked at empty homes in San Francisco. They estimated about 30,000. That number's now up to about 34,000, but it's not, when you break it down and take out homes that are for sale and homes that are in transition because somebody just bought them, you get down to a little under 17,000 homes that are in this category.
So 17,000 homes that are being kept vacant that could be rented out to people that aren't actively being rented or in transaction.
Right. This represents, I think, 16,700 is closer to the number, and it represents around 4.3% of the housing stock or the rental units in San Francisco.
Okay, so if this policy is proposed, what kinds of legal issues might we encounter, and what's considered a healthy vacancy rate for a major city?
So Vancouver says, we want to have a 3 to 5% vacancy rate. I've covered multifamily housing for a number of years, and that seems about right. When you talk to developers at that rate, they're looking to build more housing. And there's competition. So, and there's available housing for people who want it. So Vancouver's rate was down below 1%. So that is almost no housing available for rent.
Okay, so how can cities know which units are being kept vacant? How do you know?
So there are one way, what Vancouver did to try to figure this out. So you can look at government data to figure out, what the census data says, but that data is pretty old. What Vancouver did is they did an electricity usage study. So they looked for units where electricity usage was abnormally low to get a sense of how many units were actually not really being used. And that seems to be a good indicator.
That's interesting. So who supports this kind of tax and who opposes it? Based on your reporting, what did you learn?
Well, unsurprisingly, landlord organizations, apartment owners organizations are opposed to this kind of legislation, and renters organizations tend to be for it. It's unclear, though, how effective this kind of legislation can be. Hong Kong right now is in the process of doing a study to see whether this is a problem and whether having an empty homes tax would be a good way to address it. I've done a search of the economic research, and there's no research that I can find.
So we don't
whether this is a good idea, whether it works, anything about it.
Okay, so well, thank you for doing. If you were to continue reporting, what are some questions that you would want to answer on this topic?
I would want to see more economic research. I would want to see, studies, models of what it could look like, since it hasn't been implemented very many places. Paris passed a law in 2015, or a tax in 2015 on second homes. Melbourne Australia passed something earlier this year, and now we're considering it here, but there's not a lot of evidence yet, so it would have to be economic modeling, and I would just like to see whether it's really an effective solution, potentially. Right now, it seems like cities are kind of just scrambling for any solutions that they think might work.
Okay. Liz, thank you. I'm going to have you pass the microphone to Liza, who looked at another solution that has a tax component to it. So Liza looked at speculation. And Liza, if you could tell us about your story, what is speculation and why would we want to tax it? And something that came up in your story was speculation versus productive activity. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what that means?
Yeah, so speculation's a pretty murky concept. It's not like there's a really clear, singular way of distinguishing it from other kinds of real estate activity. I mean, at heart, what it means is betting that the real estate is, that prices are going up and trying to profit off of that, and it's distinguished from productive activity in that you're not really, I think they would contrast it with buying, a dilapidated, abandoned piece of property and rehabilitating it and turning it into something where people can live. Like, that's different from flipping, where you're just taking a piece of property, waiting for it to appreciate, and then selling and profiting. But there's a lot of different ways to speculate. So you can do it by flipping, but you can also, a lot of these vacant properties are people who are parking their money in San Francisco real estate because they know it's going to go up and it's a better place than, their stock markets in their own country. And so they're just leaving them vacant and waiting until, they become really valuable assets.
So break this down for us a little bit. I mean, you say somebody makes an investment, they wait, they make money. That sounds good. I mean, what is the negative, what is the downside of this? How does it affect the community?
So the reason why a lot of people don't like speculation is that what it usually means is, in order for it to be profitable, you have to take the usually rent-controlled renters out of the building by evicting them or buying them out, and then you have to bring in either market rate renters or high-paying condominium owners. You have to turn it into condominiums and bring in owners. One of the proposals that we were looking at is solutions, ways to curb speculation, and one of the solutions was taking Ellis Act evictors to court and cracking down on people who are abusing Ellis Act. And the Ellis Act is, of course, when you are able to evict your tenants because you say you're going out of the rental business, and they have to go, I don't want to do this anymore. That's a legally protected thing to do. But some flippers will come in, become real estate, become landlords for 1 second, evict everybody, then say we're going out of the real estate business, we're going to evict everybody. But they never had any intention of being landlords. So that's like abusing the loophole. So we could crack down on those, and that was one of the proposals that the candidate Mark Leno was talking about a lot. But that number is tiny compared to the number of people who just take buyouts, and so they don't go through this formal legal process that we're trying to curb by tightening up the legal procedure.
So, as I had asked Liz, where has this been tried? What kind of research has been done? Where has this happened in other places that we can learn from?
So the Ellis Act is a very California-specific thing. I mean, I think there's probably other states that have something like that, but the other proposal that I think you're talking about is a tax on speculators, and this is something that Jane Kim was talking about when she was campaigning, and there also was a proposition in 2014 called Prop G that was about basically putting such a stiff tax on flippers that people just wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be profitable. And so it wasn't about generating revenue for the city, it was just about discouraging that activity. And flippers are people who buy and then sell their property within 4 years, was the way the law defined it. And that kind of law has only been tried one other time in the United States, and that was in DC. And that was long time ago. I can't remember, but I think it was a long time ago, and they passed it, and then it was really quickly repealed because it's kind of interesting. So the reason why it was repealed is because there was a big campaign from the real estate lobby and also from African American coalitions, who at the time were the majority of the city, because they understood this anti-speculation tax as being a way to kind of stop Black people in DC from building wealth through real estate, which was a really, like, one of the most important ways that people were, you know, becoming middle class, was, you know, flipping a property and selling it and becoming a landlord. And so they campaigned against it, which is not an argument that would really map onto San Francisco's dynamics today or really anywhere.
So I have another question. You said speculation is considered as buying and selling something in under 4 years. If
or flipping.
Flipping. Let's say you bought a place and, you know, you had to move. You know, somebody in your family got sick or you got a job somewhere else. Would there be a way to argue, you know, I had to sell it, don't tax me for that? Will there be protections?
So the way that Prop G was written in 2014, which was not voted, was not passed by voters, there were exceptions for things like that. So if you had to move for a job or for any reason, there were exceptions. And what Jane Kim was saying when she was kind of reviving this idea was, we can just make it really clear. It can only, the speculation tax can only apply to buildings with 3 or more units, because most of the time when somebody is buying and selling a property that would kind of qualify for one of these exceptions, because they just, like, most of the time that's a duplex, if that makes sense. So it's somebody who bought a duplex and then had to sell it, and they were living in it, and then they had to move. But if you're just a landlord and you don't live in that building and you have to sell it really quickly, you're probably flipping it because you living there doesn't have as much to do with it. Anyway, there's ways to make that more stark, to make it more clear that it's like corporations and institutional investors rather than everyday mom and pop landlords.
Anything else you'd want to add?
I feel like one thing that's the most important, or an important thing to say, is just that speculation is not happening at the rates that it was in San Francisco, at the rates that it was happening when the market started going up after the recession and there was the tech boom and rents were rising like crazy. There was a lot more flipping than there is today, where rents are either stabilizing or even kind of going down. You can't buy low and sell high if the rents are not changing, going up like that. So it's not as urgent of an issue in San Francisco, although it makes sense because real estate is cyclical to have it in place for the next time. But there are places in California, all over California, where rents are going up and there is a lot more speculation, where it would make a lot more sense. But I think, in terms of it being an issue to campaign on, I think there are other reasons besides it, like really fixing the housing crisis, why people would like find it to be a good issue.
Okay. Any final words, things that we should know about who supports this or who would oppose something like this?
In 2014, it was the real estate lobby, and they raised a lot of money, and it was close, and the people that are for it are, tenants groups and the usual suspects. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Michael Winter, you want to add something?
A little news flash, and maybe you picked this up today. Just today, the New Zealand Parliament is forbidding foreigners from owning almost all residential property because they have a housing crisis, and they had basically, to deal with like ghost homes, vacancy tax, speculation. So they are shutting out foreigners right now in New Zealand.
I'm gonna repeat that to make sure people are heard. You said the New Zealand Parliament just today decided that they are not going to allow foreign ownership of homes in New Zealand. Almost all residential property in New Zealand, because they've been dealing with similar speculation issues. It's very interesting. Okay. Andrew. So Andrew wrote 2 stories for this issue, one on right to counsel and one on mediation services. And we'd like to talk about right to counsel first. So Andrew actually started covering this for us when Proposition F was on the ballot and it passed in June. So tell us, what does that mean for people in San Francisco?
Well, like a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight, this is a piece. None of these are umbrella solutions, but this means If you receive an eviction notice, you are entitled to a free attorney. It doesn't matter how much money you make, how much your rent is. If you are facing eviction and you want an attorney, the city will have to pay the cost of that. And that attorney most likely, and I don't know if we're going to get too deep into the details, will be from something like the American Bar Association, groups that were doing this on a much smaller scale. But this, the passage of Prop F means that the city is required to fund attorneys for anyone who's facing eviction. The numbers are very unknown. We don't know how many people are evicted in San Francisco every year. The estimates range from somewhere between, say, 1,000, 1,500 to close to 4,000, but there's no institution or organization or government agency that has firm records on that number.
So why does it matter for tenants facing eviction to have representation? What difference does it make?
Well, we could talk about in theory why it matters, is that a lot of times landlords just say, hey, you know, here's an eviction notice, and you're a tenant. You might get scared, you might give up, you might not want to fight but not know how to fight, you might not have the money to fight, the legal knowledge to fight, and so maybe you even show up to court and the judge, you know, the landlord's attorney says something that you don't even understand, and you can't make your case to the judge, and so you lose. From the stories I heard from people who represent tenants, say in many cases, if you just show up with an attorney, the landlord will say, "Oh, actually, Judge, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to throw out this eviction case." There are concrete numbers from cities around the country who have tried this, as San Francisco has, on a smaller scale, and New York City was the first and only before San Francisco to have sort of universal right to counsel for people facing eviction. They passed that in 2017. However, it did have an income limit. San Francisco's does not have an income limit. But all of these programs in San Francisco and New York and elsewhere, when the cities have invested money into free legal representation, the eviction numbers go down a lot. So there's not really a lot of debate about whether increasing money in these type of programs does decrease evictions. It simply does, and the numbers are that around 10% of tenants generally have attorneys, and around 90% of landlords have attorneys. So that imbalance is sort of the starting place, and this is, you know, going towards leveling the playing field.
And, you know, just maybe to state the obvious, but the reason that this is considered important is because we want to have more, make sure that people can stay in stable housing. Is that correct? Is that?
Yeah, like I said, this is not going to solve the displacement crisis, but this could be a little piece. This is, you know, even if it's only the low estimate of 1,000 or 1,500 people who are being evicted, let's say a third of those are being evicted unfairly. That's 500 more people who are able to stay in their home and avoid unnecessary, you know, horrible strife and life-changing circumstance.
So can you tell us a little bit about the mediation story? So I know there are different organizations that have offered mediation, and you looked into those. Where else is this an option? And since it's something that's voluntary, who tends to opt in for mediation? Because both parties have to agree to participate.
Story behind this larger movement, which is the right to counsel movement, is the idea that, you know, everyone knows you have the right to an attorney, anything you could say, you know. So if you're facing criminal charges in the United States, you get an attorney, and that stems from a court case known as Supreme Court. Gideon versus Wainwright. So this is a concept known as civil Gideon, the idea that people deserve the right to an attorney in more than just housing, and more than just criminal cases, in civil cases, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's food, because these are really serious life-changing circumstances. And that's going to require a shift in the way we see these things as human rights or as legally things that we need to spend public money to legally protect. So progress on this right to counsel for housing, could it start, moving the needle towards right to counsel for things other than housing? It remains to be seen, but I think it will require a culture shift, and so to see whether that happens, I'm interested in looking out for that.
Okay, great. So, yes. Yes, Liz has a question.
Andrew, I was just wondering if you have any numbers, if you were able to get any numbers from how much New York City is spending on its right to counsel and what it would cost for San Francisco to do that?
I sure do, or we sure do. San Francisco has been spending about $2 million for legal services. The estimates from the city controller is they think Prop F will cost between 4.2 and 5.6 annually. So there would be almost 2 to 3 times as much. New York City, let's see. Well, before the New York City law went into effect, Mayor de Blasio had vastly increased funding for legal assistance to people facing eviction. When he came into office, it was $6 million, and last year it was $77 million. And during that time, evictions fell 27%. So they spent $71 million and 27% fewer people got evicted. I don't know how big New York City's budget is, but they must have thought that was a pretty good investment. Thought it was worth it.
Okay, so what we would like to open up to questions. What we're going to do is Daphne is going to pick the questioners. I don't think we have another microphone, so if you say your question and then I will repeat it. So, Daphne.
So I saw you first. You? Yeah.
So I was curious about the income cutoff in New York City. They're roughly 10 times the size of San Francisco, and I'm wondering if San Francisco has contemplated a similar cutoff because there's some real wealth here, like in New York. So how is it that did San Francisco look to New York when they were creating their version?
So the question here is, New York has an income cutoff in terms of having free representation. Did we look to New York as our model, and if so, why did we decide not to have an income cap in offering representation to tenants?
And what is the cutoff in New York?
Right, so that was a major issue in the run-up, probably the 6-8 months before this election. The New York cutoff is 200% of the federal poverty line, which is about $24,000 for a person, about $50,000 for a family of 4. Supervisor or vice mayor at the time, Breed, was in favor of an income limit, and she was pushing that through the Board of Supervisors, trying to push that as an alternative. There was a lot of coincidence that was introduced right at the same time that this campaign was announced, within days, so there was sort of an internal and external struggle for a few months. Is the income limit going to survive, or is this initiative without an income limit going to be the one that eventually gets put before the voters? From what I heard from advocates, there's very few wealthy people, a few points. There's very few wealthy people that are evicted. There's a lot of people in the middle that might be over the limit but still can't realistically afford an attorney. That was another of the arguments against the income limits. And so this was what survived the political process, was the idea that everyone deserves an attorney. So this idea of what happened, what was done in New York was definitely raised, and the people who pushed this initiative did not think that was proper.
Okay, Daphne, who's next?
So in my experience, landlords will often threaten to evict and then offer a buyout, which is much less than the tenant actually deserves to be bought out. In a case like that, is there any additional protection, or do you get access to a lawyer if you've been offered a buyout as well, or no?
I'm going to restate that. So the question was, if you've been threatened with an eviction but then offered a buyout, can you get any legal advice when contemplating this?
This initiative does not apply unless you have received an eviction notice, but the city has, and I believe I'm sure will continue to have people who could offer legal advice to people in all different housing situations, and there's also nonprofits around the city. But if you're not threatened with eviction, this does not apply to you.
So Daphne, who's next?
Yes, speaking of speculation, you mentioned something about the flippers who would empty the building and then they would flip. Well, obviously, for them to flip, they would have to do some remodeling. So have you looked into how we could connect applying for permit applications for upgrades, remodels, to evictions, buyouts, and somehow get the city planning to do some sort of rates, putting some sort of rates on permits that were obtained after a buyout?
Okay, so the question was, could we look at what's happening in different city agencies and maybe see what's happening through applying for permits when renovations are happening and seeing if they followed an eviction and maybe connecting the dots and see if that pointed to a speculative situation. Liza, what do you have to say about that?
I think that there's a couple of problems with that, and the first is that it's not illegal to go out of the landlord business and sell to somebody who's going to remodel the building and still be renting. And so it's only, so if the person buys the building and basically I don't know if that's a thing that's happening, but that's not the illegal part, if that makes sense. And then also, I mean, people do flip without, doing remodels that require permits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Michael Winter, you wanted to add something?
Yes.
I can offer a personal story, because that's how I was pushed out of my apartment in the Richmond district after 23 years. The family sold, and the buyers came in. The day that they closed on our building, it was a 4-unit building, the day they closed, we received a letter telling us, I mean, I'm surprised they did this, but laying it out, saying that they were trying to flip the building, get a profit, and hopefully, the next owner would come in and, they'd keep us all happy, because, simply by selling a rent-controlled building, you can't clear the tenants out. So that's how they started. They were completely upfront about it. Problem is, we fought them as best we could, but it got down to eventually a buyout. But I actually discovered that they were pulling permits for electrical, plumbing, and what have you, and the way they were doing it was not above board, so it was just going through DBI. So that actually slowed it down when they realized that they weren't going to be able to, push us out as quickly as they wanted to. But in the end, they filed an Ellis Act eviction. I'd been in the building 23 years. There was a couple on the first floor. They were 80 years old. They had been in the building almost 35 years. So all we were trying to do was to get them more time. They got an extra year to be gone. We had to be gone in about 3 months. And they got a little bit more money to have to relocate. And as last I heard, they ended up getting pushed out to Sacramento, and the fellow had a stroke, and it was not in good health anyway, so.
Okay, Daphne, who's our next question? I can't see you. Daphne, who's our next question?
Started trying to get people to encourage them, those 17,000 units, and then from the last part of that, people who move into those units, free lawyers, with people who gave them access, who didn't want to because they were afraid that how they were going to get them out. Now those tenants have access to a lawyer, whereas people who bought the units and rented them in good faith, so then move people out, and now you're telling them, no, you can't do that. Instead, we're going to give these people a lawyer and fight them. So, at one point, it seems to be trying to encourage people to rent out to their 17,000 units, and yet, on the other hand, we're saying, well, if you do that, we're going to make sure that these people stay there even after you want them out.
Okay, I'm going to, I think I heard that, correct me if I'm wrong. You were saying, this kind of links together two stories. You were saying with the ghost homes, the city wants to encourage renting of the vacant units, but then with Prop F, now will offer legal representation if anyone in those units is threatened with eviction, and you felt as though there was some sort of a conflict. But I'm not sure. So what is the question? Trumpery. I hear the word. What's the question? Oh, is there a contradiction between those two policies? Okay. Who would like to tackle that?
Well, for starters, you'd have to ask the advocates for these two policies whether they feel there's a contradiction. Well, I only covered one of these. The one response that I heard that I think would apply to your question is advocates of the right to counsel said this is not going to necessarily keep people from getting evicted. It simply means that if they're facing eviction, they will have a lawyer to represent them, to put them on equal footing so that if they're being unfairly evicted, that won't happen. Obviously, your view of what lawyers can and can't do and what happens inside a courtroom will color whether you feel that's the actuality of the situation. But their response would be, evictions are not going to stop. If a tenant is still acting improperly, illegally, being a nuisance, the judge will still see that. And a lawyer won't be able to erase that from happening.
F has not yet gone into effect. When will it go into effect? And what is the mechanism by which a threatened, potentially evicted tenant can avail him or herself of these free legal services? How do you get the attorney paid, and how do you initiate that process of being represented by the city's paying?
The question is, when does Proposition F go into effect? How do the attorneys get matched up with the tenants who need them? Who pays them? How do they get paid? How does that process work?
So what the initiative said was that the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development had 12 months to come up with a plan, starting, I believe, 2 weeks from when the election was certified. So I believe the election results were certified in early July. So the clock started ticking in late July, and they have 12 months to come up with a plan. Sometime in July of 2019 will be then, therefore, the date by which this right is given to tenants facing eviction. What it will look like is unclear. Last I checked in was a few weeks ago. They were still waiting to see how much the Board of Supervisors was going to allocate to developing this program. And of course, that number is just going to pay for the next fiscal year, which I believe ends on July 1st. So they're not even allocating money for the attorneys yet. They're allocating money for development of the program at this point. How it will work, the best guess seems to be an expansion of what currently exists, where attorneys from the Bar Association and other sort of pro bono attorneys, they'll simply expand that. They probably won't be city-employed attorneys, and where the sort of entry point will be is still unclear.
So if anyone was to get threatened with eviction today, they would not be protected under Prop F.
So if you're threatened with eviction today, you are not protected under Prop F.
Correct. There are other programs that have existed for years, but Prop F is not protecting you.
Okay, Daphne, okay.
Well, I want to thank you for organizing this. I was one of the candidates running for mayor, but I was not mentioned in whatever you're talking today. My solution is that we 35% Asian property owners are small property owners. And many of us want them to run it out and help people. But the government itself is a problem and a joke. We do not have incentive and we don't have any aid when we face abusive attendants. We have a lot of tenants, they pay Chinese to sue. And we have a lot of Asian property owners being sued. And none of you mentioned in the report. My advice to you is to do a fair investigatory. report to help the 35% Asian property owners that many of us been sued because we do not speak the language and because we do not have legal representation. Many people are hardworking. We work 3 jobs, 2 jobs to buy a house and we sublease some part of the house. But we got in trouble because we don't understand the law. So if you fair enough for investigatory, it's not about mainstream American. It's about diversity in San Francisco. And I want you guys to help the property owners who does not speak the language. We are suffering from those lawsuits.
Okay, I'm going to restate this. Tell me if I've got this correct. You're saying that among small property owners in San Francisco, that about 35% of them are Asian, some of whom would need legal services, need translation and legal services, and are seeking help. In any of your reporting, did you encounter conversations about that, or people talking about the challenges for landlords who need, who are also small property owners who are also struggling with legal issues because of language barriers and the ability to afford legal representation?
The Small Property Owners Association did talk about that. They didn't talk specifically about Asians or people of different ethnicities needing translation services or things like that, but that they talked about a concern that small property owners of minority groups would have a more difficult time with any kind of attacks on properties that are being held empty for whatever reason.
I mean, I believe for the Asian community, you know, the Asian Law Caucus, and you have community organizations out there that are doing exactly what you're asking. And if they're not, then, you know, I think that's, you know, given the language issues, that's probably where you'd start. But broader than that, the San Francisco Bar Association still, I believe, offers pro bono counsel. I don't think it's anything that's restricted to tenants. And then if a small property owner came and you know, you were financially strapped, I don't think the Bar Association is going to turn you down. And that's out there, and they have their legal referral service. So I'm not sure, not being a lawyer, if anyone in the audience knows better, then inform us.
So you're saying the San Francisco Bar Association will offer legal advice to people on
yeah, for a wide range
of property issues, whether you're a landlord or a tenant. So that's a good place to start. Daphne, who's next?
This woman here in the back. I'm
We
sorry,
can't
we don't
read,
have.
These people, the small landlords, it is true there are a lot of abusive landlords, but I feel, I'm Chinese American, I've been reading a lot of the paper. Some group of people, I feel, are politicizing the issue for their own gain and votes or whatever. I really want them to, especially not English speaking, try to integrate with the mainstream, because I'm really upset by some of the stories, especially this paper from Epoch Times. And Ellen Zhao and this refugee or Wang woman, they always go on and say everybody's discriminating against Chinese. That's not true. They say the Bar Association gives free legal. They've been saying that, oh, why you always just speak to the tenant help and not the landlords? Right now it stands that way, but they are helpful. They should be seeking help, have a dialogue with other people, to integrate yourself as an immigrant. Because a lot of times, I feel that a lot of Chinese Americans say, we're Chinese, we're not with, you know, whatever, you know. And they do their own thing. And I remember this woman, during the cannabis debate, I think she went on it, unless she's misquoted, she said something like, oh, the Sunset District, we want to stay this way. We don't want a lifestyle. It has to come to the Sunset District. Stuff like that.
So I'm not sure, do you have a specific question, or?
Are they willing to, the city willing to make sure that they get the help they need so that they won't go and complain, be unfairly treated because it's always discrimination against like
So is the city going to ensure that small property owners?
Now they're saying that, but there's a small apartment association, Joseph and Chow runs it. They have help.
Okay.
So I'm going to make sure the groups up there have a dialogue with these
suggestion.
Okay, so I'm not, thank you for your comments. I didn't hear exactly the question. I think you were suggesting that groups work together to make sure everyone has the representation they need.
And then you're next.
Okay, I just know this wonderful woman here saying something against their own race. I am here for 30
Can you
years.
please let her speak? Thank you.
Okay, when you're speaking, we respect that. Thank you. So I'm learning American way of speaking civil way. Okay. I did not accuse you anything, ma'am.
Listen, we're all here to learn from each other and to hear other people's opinions. This is, okay, thank you.
Well, we're here to understand what causes the housing crisis in San Francisco. My question to you in your report, have you done any investigation how much it costs, the total amount from the small property owners' money as well as the insurance company to compensate the abusive tenants? Now, I am not pointing some of the tenants have been evicted viciously. In fact, we have another side of story that landlords, small property owners who has one house, they work hard, they want to keep this house as their retirement. However, they have been used as money like ATM machine. They use their equity to compensate the tenants who they know that they have very strong support from the legal counsel. Proposition F, yes, everyone is entitled to legal counsel. And the city has the money to fund those attorneys. I'm not talking the pro bono. Pro bono attorneys tends to help tenants more than landlords because landlords has that much of money from their own bank account or their equity from the property. However, the attorney who is advertising that if you sue, if I can help you, and if I don't get any compensation, I'm not going to charge you. That is very attractive to tenants who wants to get profit out of the rent. That is my number one. Where did you make any investigation? How much total in the last 5 years or even the latest year that the money has been going into the abusive attorneys and the abusive landlords, the tenants' pockets? Instead, we should have the money going into the legal counsel mediation because we do have legal paper called contract.
Okay.
We have contract signed between tenant and landlord. We should find and agree upon on the terms. My next question.
Hold on. Let me start with that one. It sounds like the question was, do we have, and we're going to wrap this up. Do we have any research on the amount of money that landlords have had to spend fighting perhaps predatory cases?
Can't even imagine. I mean, you could do that. I don't, because just thinking top of my head how difficult that might be. I mean, if it's in court, you'd have to go through all kinds of court filings and look at unlawful detainers and see how they're adjudicated and whether or not, they're abusive or not. Again, it's not anything that has to be reported to any city agency, anything like that. This is,
so it'd be difficult to track.
Yeah, this is, and working on contingency, that's what a lot of lawyers will do, and that's why they seek bigger payouts, whether it's an auto accident or an eviction or anything like that. That's part of the legal system right now. It would be a great project to try to do. We're so tiny, we're smaller than the Small Property Owners Association. If we get more money from people, then yeah, we could maybe look into that because we'd like, we're interested in that too because there are bad tenants out there.